My name is Lisa Hollaba. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Columbia College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to a really fascinating evening of conversation about our core curriculum. I think that most of you, all of you, will know that we are celebrating this year the centennial of our core curriculum. Contemporary civilization was taught for the first time in fall 1919, and although the syllabus now looks pretty different than it did then, we still feel it has a shared mission, which is, and I'll quote from the original syllabus, to explore the insistent problems of the present through a consideration of primary texts of history, philosophy, government, economics, and sociology. In 1937, the faculty of Columbia College declared contemporary civilization to have been a success in giving students, and I'll quote again, a sound and broad and vital basis on which to build further scholarly work. And, bolstered by this success, they implemented a similarly interdisciplinary course, this one based in narratives that are literary and philosophical and religious in nature, first known as Humanities. It would be renamed Literature Humanities in 1962. The core curriculum also includes art humanities, music humanities, frontiers of science, university writing, and requirements in global core, science, and foreign languages. And we strongly believe that each one of these courses adds a rich component to an undergraduate education at Columbia. But we do often look to contemporary civilization and literature humanities as something of anchors of the core, not least because they are each year-long courses and because students take them as an entire cohort. At the college, every first-year student is taking literature humanities right now, and every sophomore student is taking contemporary civilization. In my role, I have had the pleasure of talking with alumni across many different generations of Columbia Lions and hearing them describe the impact that the core curriculum has had on their ways of thinking about the way of the world and acting in the world. And many of them talk about how they enjoy revisiting these texts and the books from the core today. In fact, when one alum was asked, I believe he was from a class in the 1960s, what advice would you give to current Columbia students? He said, tell them not to sell their core books because they'll just end up buying them back in 30 years. But even given that sort of enthusiasm among our alumni, it's not every one of them who would sign up to take the core all over again. But that is exactly what David Denby set out to do, first in the 1990s and now again in this centennial year. And I won't describe any more of that because we'll get a chance to hear about it firsthand from him right after I share my introduction of our speakers tonight. David Denby was educated at Columbia College, Columbia School of Journalism, and Stanford. He's the author of Great Books, which brings us here tonight, an acclaimed account of returning to college and reading the Western classics during the culture wars. American Sucker, his wrenching memoir of getting caught up in the stock market at the time of the tech bubble and the breakup of his marriage. Snark, a polemic against the spread of nasty low sarcasm as a journalistic style in the internet age. Do the Movies Have a Future, a collection of his best movie criticism from The New Yorker. And Lit Up, a prequel of sorts to Great Books, in which he embeds in 10th grade English classes at 3 public schools to see if and how teenagers can be turned on to serious reading. Julie Crawford is Mark Van Doren Professor of Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She works on 16th and century English literature and culture and has written on Shakespeare, John Fletcher, Margaret Cavendish, the Sidneys, Anne Clifford, Margaret Hobie, and Mary Roth, as well as on post-Reformation religious culture, the history of reading, and the history of sexuality. Her book, Marvelous Protestantism, Monstrous Births in Post-Reformation England, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2005, and her most recent book, Mediatrix, Women, Politics, and Literary Production in Early Modern England, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. This year, Mr. Denby has been visiting Professor Crawford's Contemporary Civilization course. Nicholas Dames is a Theodore Kahan Professor of Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he teaches 19th century fiction, the history and theory of the novel, the history of reading, and the aesthetics of prose fiction from the 18th century to the present. His interests center on the long history of novelistic form in Britain and Western Europe. He is the author of Amnesiac Selves, Nostalgia, Forgetting, and British Fiction, 1810 to 1870, and The Physiology of the Novel, Reading, Neuroscience, and the Form of Victorian Fiction. This year, Mr. Denby has been visiting Professor James' Literature Humanities course. So to start us off, Mr. Denby will talk a bit about what inspired him to return to campus and to the core, first in the 1990s and now today. And then he and Professor Crawford and Professor James will then have a conversation about their experience of the core curriculum, and then we'll have some time for question and answers at the end. And I turn things over now to David Denby.
Thank you, Lisa, and the Dean's office staff, and Bernice Tsai and the alumni office staff for putting on this Justin Timberlake concert with all of this media. I'm going to go on a bit because not just because I wrote this book, but I need to explain to myself as much as anyone, what in the world am I doing here at the age of 76, taking Lit Hum for the third time. I was only able to come twice to Julie's CC class because I'm allegedly working for a living, and I will try to come back to CC next year. I was passing Tom's Restaurant in September, and remembrance of floured gravy on meatloaf came back. And I thought, well, I'm home, but thank God Tom's is only a small part of it. My perspective is that of an outsider, a journalist, a reader. The most encouraging thing anyone said to me in 1990-91 when I was working on the book was Irving Howe, literary critic, socialist intellectual. I started to tell him what I was doing. I got no more than a sentence, and he said, "You're what I've been looking for, the common reader." The usage, of course, comes from Virginia Woolf. She collected her casual essays under that rubric, a couple volumes of it, and she meant someone who reads for pleasure, possibly for instruction, possibly to understand herself a little better or her world a little better. An outsider's perceptions are likely to be too blunt, too summary, too much infused with his own needs and desires, and that's why I'm so eager to talk to my professor friends here, because they live these issues every day and have been for years. This thing has survived despite many challenges, both externally and internally, and there are many people involved in it who love it and keep it going. There are many intellectual and even moral justifications, which I'm very wary of saying. I certainly don't want to build my own idiosyncrasies into an attempted universal law of any kind. Carl Hovde, who was professor of English here and dean of the college, 68 to 72. Dean Hovde, who put the place back on its feet, one of the many people, after the Troubles, in 1968 said that you can't consider yourself educated if you haven't read some such selection of books like this. I don't actually believe that. I don't think there's any royal road to heaven. I think there are many ways of being well educated. However, this is a good way to begin your education. It's a frankly elitist remark, what Dean Hovde said. It was unfashionable then, and it's practically unspeakable now, but I won't be trolled because I'm just quoting him. Let me get in a few licks here at other places, because it's interesting. Mortimer Adler got his PhD here, went to Chicago in the 30s, linked up with Robert Hutchins, and started their very distinguished version of these courses, which continue, except that the freshmen are not required to read the same selection of books anymore. They dropped that as a political affront some years ago. They have to read within a selection of core courses as a kind of introduction to their education. It's lectures and seminars. It's not entirely seminars. As here, Yale's directed studies started in 1947, just as Lisa said. CC started in part as a reaction to the First World War. I believe Yale's directed studies started in part as a reaction to the Second World War. What can we preserve from this mess, from these ruins? It's terrific. 3 integrated courses: literature, philosophy, history, and political thought, lectures and seminars. It's a kind of ordeal for the students and a kind of band of brothers or band of brothers and sisters spirit. develops among those who take it. Harvard, a few years ago, began Humanities 10. Luke Menand, who got his PhD here and taught Lidham for a while, was one of the ones instrumental in getting it started. And it's interesting, it's like Lidham in some ways and not others. It starts with the Odyssey, not with the Iliad. Why is that? Well, in the second semester, the first semester goes chronologically, like Lidham, somewhat different reading list, but it's the same idea. Second semester starts with Pete Buttigieg's favorite novel, James Joyce's Ulysses. Try teaching that in a couple of weeks. And then it goes in reverse chronological order, second semester. So I get it. These books speak backward and as well as forward. But by beginning with the Odyssey rather than the Iliad, they sort of squared the circle, because that has to reach forward to Ulysses so that the students understand what in the world Joyce is doing when they begin the second semester. Humanities 10 is a hot course. So is directed studies. Why? Because there's a common perception that kids may not have read much, and we were just talking about this in high school. I investigated some high school English. It's pretty dismaying. Of course, there are some students who are fabulously well-read, but many are not, and there's a lack. At Harvard, kicks them out of the yard if they take Humanities 10, and they have to go to the Boston Symphony or the Boston Ballet or the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum or something. They have to. The assumption is that the fear is that they might come out of pop culture and the internet, and after school go back to pop culture and the internet and not have much acquaintance with the older arts. They don't have music humanities or art humanities. These courses are honors courses. There's a certain cachet in taking them. At Columbia, we spread the cachet to everyone. It's a gift and a burden, let's say, for everyone. It's a community. Not just something special for a tiny group of students. But in 1961, when I was a freshman, I was overawed, I was unconscious. I don't think I'd finished a lot of things, since I'm the slowest reader in the Western world. I was abashed, I don't think I said much. And I hoped for some benefit that I couldn't possibly have explained or understood. Now, Italo Calvino, wonderful Italian writer, said this in 1986, books read then, meaning when you're young, can be, possibly at one and the same time, formative in the sense that they give a form to future experiences, providing models, terms of comparison, schemes for classification, scales of value, exemplars of beauty. That's quite a lot, isn't it? All things that contend, here comes the kicker, all things that continue to operate even if the book read in one's youth is almost or totally forgotten. This is the haunting issue always of education in the humanities, and it's one reason that it's so hard to sell in crass terms to parents who are afraid their children are not going to take courses that aren't going to lead directly to a job. I mean, that is what is its effect on you? What do you retain? What is the residue? I would say it's something like readiness. Not mindfulness, which the Kant word of the moment, which is, means attentiveness without judgment. I'm a critic. Over my dead body, am I giving up judgment? And readiness is ravaged by time, by your life, by the public atmosphere that you live in. The second time was 1991-92. I was 48 years old. I was movie critic of New York Magazine, occasional essayist elsewhere. I was married to the novelist Kathy Shine, then married, father of 2 boys, rampaging all over the place. But I felt no complaints about my life, except in one respect. I felt lost, not in a dark wood, but in, if anything, in an overlit, neonized canyon of flashing lights. It my head was in the media all the time. It's partially my own obsessive. And of course, this was before the internet and 24-hour cable news. I had no idea where I ended and the media began. I didn't know what my opinions were, or anything like that. There was, of course, a culture war going on, which, of course, persists in somewhat different terms now. But the left critique, which I'm going to state in its extreme version, is that a hegemonic and triumphalist discourse, which represents the interests of white males, is potentially destructive of the ego and identity of everyone else. You still hear versions of that. The critique has considerable force, and it has changed the courses in a way that we're going to talk about. What I objected to, though, was the distance from the reading experience, the existential situation, a reader and her book. I didn't hear that. I didn't see that. And there was a kind of excessive politicization of discussion of works of art and philosophy that repelled me. On the right side, there were sort of stupid defense of this sort of thing by Lynn Cheney and William Bennett and many others, which continues. And the latest form is the wanting to have only classically styled buildings in Washington. The successive heads of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cheney and Bennett. We're talking of a kind of patriotic shield and a pointed sword directed at other cultures. That was not what we meant here at all. That was not what we meant. Kathy got tired of my carrying on and said, go back up there and why don't you take the courses again? And I thought it would make a magazine article. And it took 5 years, and it was 150,000 words. So it became an extraordinarily difficult undertaking. I sat in 2 sections of Lidham, Edward Taylor and Jim Shapiro, and 1 section of CC, Andrew Stephenson, all fabulous teachers. I wrote everything down, and I tried to shape the chapters towards a pointed interrogation of certain points, of political and intellectual issues. And I noticed a couple of things, and I'll be just briefly. First of all, the books are in contention with one another. That's the way they're taught. Playwrights take over the Homeric legends and darken them and investigate their perversities. Aristotle disputes his teacher, Plato. The New Testament treats the Old as a kind of unconscious prelude. Locke appears to be answering Hobbes, and so on down the line. So to speak of it as, certainly they're connected, but the connection is often contentious. Second, the teachers have been through modernism, many of them. That is, they had read Dostoevsky and T.S. Eliot and seen plays by Beckett and so on, and they were at home with discordancies and disharmonies. They were repelled by complacency of any sort. Lionel Trilling here, in the 50s and 60s, was obsessed with the radical critique of bourgeois society. It's all there in his collection, Beyond Culture, which came out in 1965. It's very much part of the atmosphere. So if anything, the courses inculcated, I discovered, a spirit of constant self-criticism, certainly not triumphalism. Now, the issue of power is very complicated, but as someone who sort of wrote about the commercial art of movies for a long time, I just want to say that almost anything that gets past the living room in a loft has some connection to power. And that's true now for people who are thankfully breaking through and telling stories that they weren't able to tell in the past. There are new editors, new audiences. But if the connection to power was the only thing that mattered, they would not last. They would not survive. There has to be some figurative or descriptive or allegorical power in fiction making or discourse that's enormously influential on the way we continue to see ourselves and our relation to the state and to each other. This time, I would just say that I have buried a lot of work by privileged white males in my career as a movie critic. Most everything that is produced disappears. There has to be stronger reasons than the initial connection to power, or even the continuing connection to power, for it to interest. People will not read boring books 10 years or 100 years or 2,000 years after they were written. This time, I was drawn here by the anniversary, the centenary, and a directly selfish need. Now, Professor Taylor, Edward Taylor, late Edward Taylor, told his students in September 1991, on the first day, you're here for selfish reasons. What? You're here to create a self. And how do you do that? Well, you throw yourself against these extraordinary works, older works of art, that are very different from your expectations, from the art that you know, and from the life that you know. And some of it echoes back, and some of it does not. And it's even a little frightening. And you have to stretch, possibly, to take in what connection you have. So, I mean, if he was talking about the Iliad, I mean, the glorification of violence is extremely upsetting. But Homer sort of makes everything magnificent. I mean, the feasts and games are magnificent. Everything is extended to the outer edge of effort, at the outer edge possibility of failure also. And that is stunning. And I think the dialectic of the book that I wrote, although I would never have been able to say it at the time, was back and forth between the heroic works that I was reading, or the discourses that try to go to the end of something, and my own very conventionally bourgeois, middle-class fatherhood, personhood, household owner, so on, back and forth between those two things. So I allowed the books and my life to spill into each other. In the end, I did begin to see the border between myself and the world a little. I had a stronger sense of what I believed, which I think could be termed a kind of liberal humanism that's very much part of the New Yorker magazine, which was where I was writing by the end. It appears a little defenseless at this terrible moment, but which doesn't mean it lacks value. This time, well, the second time was remaking in Taylor's terms, which I adopted for myself. Now I'm on the edge of old age. And let me tell you, the principal physical issue of old age is memory. You can always get down on the floor and do 10 push-ups. 5. Whatever. You always find a trainer, assuming you're not just falling apart. And the principal moral issue and morale issue is ego strength. Without that, the body goes out of disuse or despair. You know, if you read Lear when you're younger, it makes poetic sense, but it doesn't really make dramatic sense at any age. No, but boy, when you read it again in your 70s, it makes emotional sense in a way that it couldn't possibly when you were younger. Reason, not the need. You struggle to hold on to what you've got or to reopen those paths that have become covered with dead leaves. No, that's the wrong, have become just sunken out of sight, but they can be retrenched. And I'm grateful, very grateful for being taught again and reading again. And that upsurge of memory and a feeling that comes with it is very exciting. And the second reason is a kind of need at this awful moment. We were just reading Wilhelm Montaigne withdrawing into his tower in the 1550s during the awful strife between Catholics and Protestants. We are in a moment when the public discourse, at least on one side, is so crassly stupid and so dedicated to fraud that you need some refuge. Havel called it living in truth in his great essay about this. The state may be fraudulent, but you need to read and think clearly for yourself. Abraham holding a knife drives Donald Trump out of my head, at least for a while. You need to build some fortress of your own against lies and fraud. So I would say I was awed and unconscious the first time, revived the second time, feeling very lucky to be at Columbia the third time. The first reading of Oedipus Rex, my reaction was one of fear. The second reading, as a middle-aged man, the drive for power of any sort, never mind being head of the state, head of the family, or a member of the family running a business, necessarily entails some sort of blindness. Because you can't function if you see everything. And the question in middle age is how you resolve those things when you realize what you see and what you're not seeing. The third time, I think, was closer to admiration for Oedipus's courage in the state of actual blindness at last to be able to see. So my wife Susan said, she said, that's the 3 ages of man without a riddle. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll get on to the next part right now. We've talked about some of these things before in camera. One major change from 30 years ago, the students have become very international. Well, it was starting 30 years ago. In 1961, it was all male, it was almost all white, and it was 50% Jewish. It's very different now. So when you think I'm facing a very international group of students, how does that affect your thinking about how you're presenting Western text to them?
I mean, I'd say there are a bunch of different 17% international, but for the last about 5 years, also about 50% underrepresented students. And that, both of those changes feel huge, as does, I think Nick and I have both noticed, we came here at the same time. We came here at the end of the previous century, the very end. And that also the changing face of the Professoriate. I remember the first time I sat in the Lit-Hum lecture room and I was frankly horrified at all the teachers who looked like that exact demographic. And that has radically changed as well, although not as much as most of us would like. So I'd say that those are some of the biggest changes I've certainly seen in my time. The international thing affects it as well in ways that I find surprising and deeply rewarding. Like I remember I had students who, we were doing Thucydides. I've taught Lit-Hum 7 times. This is my first time teaching CC. And we can talk about which is better. And I had students talking, they were rewriting the Melian dialogue from Thucydides, and it was a student from Ukraine, a student from Algeria, and a student from Detroit. And they were rewriting it in light of the Crimean crisis that was going on at the time. And it was amazing. I mean, it was the work that was happening there had nothing to do with me. It tangentially had something to do with Thucydides, and it had everything to do with the students learning to listen to each other and to think about how political conflict and how really political propaganda is produced. I'm sure you have other...
I mean, I share that experience of feeling like the demographics of the classroom have changed in the lamentably 20 plus years we've been doing this, right? Mm-hmm. But in surprising ways, and I think, David, you may have observed some of this in the section that you're in this year. A lot of the time I think that there's been an interesting kind of smoothing of expertise, pre-existing expertise in the room, mm-hmm. given that as the population internationalizes, it's also the case that the students from more familiar backgrounds of the kind that would end up in the Ivy League tend to have had secondary education, which is actually a lot less embedded in particularly literature than might have been the case even 20 years ago. And so that it feels in a way as even if it's geographically far-flung, as far as comfort with these texts, it's remarkably even. Although there's surprises, and what I'm thinking of is actually sometimes, in fact, pre-existing familiarity with the kinds of things we're doing may even be more common among some of the international students. So we have a student in our section this year, right, who will occasionally speak up. She's from China. Her command of written English is quite good. Her command of spoken English fluctuates. Who will occasionally speak up with tremendously subtle points she's gleaned from Dostoevsky, right?
Yeah.
And it's just not available to almost anybody else in the room yet. So it's often hard to predict. And I mean, I'm tempted to say something like this has a lot to do with class and how that intersects with the internationalization of the student body in ways that are complicated. But strangely enough, I don't feel now the same sense that I did when I started. There was a wild variation in the room as far as familiarity. I used to feel like I had to manage that much more than I do now. I feel much more secure now in assuming that there's very little in the way of familiarity, pre-existingness, whereas I used to feel like there was now I can assume, I mean, if I'm going to be blunt about it, I can assume that students are, and I polled them just this morning or yesterday, are going to be familiar with Shakespeare still. Has a residual, certainly on American secondary syllabi, still has a residual force, and probably a lot of them have read the Odyssey, and that's about it. In some ways, that makes my job easier. It's odd to say, but it does mean that I'm less attentive than I used to be to real imbalances in terms of expertise than I might have had beforehand. The imbalances are there, but they're just different now, right? But as far as just coming in feeling like I'm comfortable with this stuff already, that feels like it's just smoothed out gradually over the last 20 years. And that we can lament that, but from the position of a teacher, it actually, it presents certain opportunities, and it actually makes our job a little easier, I would almost say. I mean, I don't know if you feel similarly.
No, it's true. I mean, I think I used to feel in the past that there was also a huge divide, and this has to do with the demographics you were talking about. The real divide was between students who'd gone to private schools and students who'd gone to public schools. And Nick and I were just talking about, in interesting ways, that has radically changed as well, because the curricula at private schools have radically changed, as have the curricula at public schools. And it's so, as we all know, especially now in an increasingly divided America, that's also really different, what people are getting at public schools in different states.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, the idea of there being sort of an uneven playing field that is predicated on having access to or some engagement with a certain set of texts is increasingly recessive.
Right.
I agree with Nick. I always ask them too what they've read before, and that, or even what they've been exposed to before. And yeah, objectively, that is decreasing.
And decreasing the question I asked, and I think you hadn't yet arrived in the room, I asked this informally before class started. I said, so in high school, tell me what you read that was written before 1900. And the answer tended to be a Shakespeare play, maybe one Shakespeare play a year, and maybe the Odyssey, and that was about it. And I fired off some other possibilities and got a lot of blank looks. And so this does mean, interestingly, it means a less conflictual classroom than sometimes used to exist. I do remember some real battles in the classroom from when I first started, just between those who felt like they had a right to the material that other students didn't. And I do feel now it's almost as if they all feel they have the same right or an equal lack of right to the material. So it should, in some ways, I guess my summary would be, it would feel as if internationalization would produce more fractures, but it feels like the reverse has actually happened.
That's amazing. One of the things that those of us who were educated in high school in the 50s and 60s had was the kind of conventional periodization culturally, going backward. And Life magazine, Henry Luce used to bring out these magnificent picture books with tapestries and sharp, and it's the conventional periodization, the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, the age of discovery, like that, through the Victorian period. And I wondered, with texts by actual historians, and these were very popular in middle-class households, and I wondered if kids have that sort of scroll that goes, you can run it backwards or forwards anymore, and whether, in fact, Lidham CC isn't a way of framing different periods. No, you're saying no, but I mean, it's a kind of intellectual history as well as textual examination.
I mean, the immediate thing I would say about that is, I think, and this is related to what Nick said, I think most students experience it as on two fronts. One front is it is a primary encounter with primary texts. And so increasingly that is a first-time encounter with primary texts. And that the work involved is primarily about making their way through this thicket of ideas.
Right.
The second way they approach it is more meta and comes from a very present perspective, a presentist perspective, right? Of like, we understand that there are these dominant narratives, or we understand that there are these epistemological sort of ideas that we frankly, I'm speaking the students' perspectives, that we frankly see in deeply problematized terms. Like students reading Descartes in the age of the Anthropocene and students reading about man conquering nature, they're not having a relationship to that that's like, woo, enlightenment, like, au contraire, mon frère, right? Obviously, the relationship they're having with that is profoundly different, and that the idea of like, well, what happened to indigenous knowledges, right, in the New World conquest is actually an issue not simply of some kind of sympathy, but of actual epistemological crisis of like the kinds of knowledge that we destroyed and that we are now reaping the benefits of, frankly. And that, the thing about that encounter of that longer narrative of like whatever ideas of the triumph of certain models of civilization is that the students are coming at it deeply from the present and not in some like the sense that people often say when they want to snowflake students or see them as like PC or whatever, but they're really reading these things. Like we were doing Adam Smith today, The Wealth of Nations, and the students were just talking about corporations. We were talking about corporations. I thought it was going to go one way, and the students took it there's one of my students here, the students took it in a totally different direction, and that's as it should be. It doesn't actually matter what my narrative is, doesn't matter what the narrative of the founders was, doesn't matter what the narrative of the chair is, right? It's the students who are in the room who are making those encounters.
Well, are you speaking of the dissolution of all narratives or of a counter-narrative?
Oh, of just where the students are coming in 2020, which was different than where they came in having done this for a long time.
Right.
It's profoundly different from where I'm looking at former students in the room too. It's profoundly different from where students were coming in, say, 1999 when I started teaching, right? Or where they were coming in 2001. Right, where whatever the aegis of understanding about the things that we have wrought or certain kinds of ideas have wrought are thrown into radical relief in a different way, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that and maybe put it in some sort of very, very broad conceptual terms, my memories of my first years teaching this course were that theology could be somewhat explosive in the classroom. Mm-hmm. There were just a lot of feelings, and also a lot of pre-existing attachments, right? And I now feel sometimes in the position of needing to really explain certain battles and why anybody might have cared, whereas other things immediately pop out. So just as we were just reading Montaigne, right? And I think I felt a great deal of puzzlement in the room, which we didn't really have fully time to explore, about exactly the religious wars of the 16th century, right? But to think about Montaigne's experience of indigeneity, just immediately, they had a way to locate that. They had already a pre-existing way of thinking about that and talking about it. It's not that they lack a historical grid. The orientation points in that historical grid are fundamentally different than they were certainly when I was in high school, and I think even 20 years ago. So now this does mean two things. I think it means working with that, but sometimes I'd also say it means pulling against it a little bit. If only because it's obvious to say, but like some of these theological matters could not be more crucial as a way of understanding the text, and they do need to be spelled out. So it is always this game, right, of working with their orientation, but also suggesting other kinds. It's just that what has to be worked with and has to be resisted has really shifted.
You have the sense that many had read the Old Testament or the New? I couldn't tell. I mean, well, there's one person who obviously
one person who was
very
trained in a religious school.
And trained,
I can't tell exactly, but I can tell that it feels very different than it did in the late 90s, where I felt often very worried stepping into the classroom about what I was going to be saying and how it would be resisted. And I did have students who were quite upset with me in the past. It's been a long time since I've had a student upset with me when discussing the Bible, which just hasn't happened recently. And I don't know, I mean, admittedly, that might just be I'm older now, right? So it's harder to get upset with me because I'm now, I'm graying. But I don't think it's just that. I think that the stakes, or just even the pre-existing attachments to those are weaker. Yeah. And it's important to note, we won't get too into this, even the one student who was trained essentially by priests is not himself Catholic, right? So that even those students who possess a lot of that background are not attached to it in the same ways. And that, I think, has just, frankly, it's made life a lot easier in certain respects. I don't quite have the same obsessive worries when I step into the classroom at those moments, but on the other hand, the intellectual task is tough.
But I would add that the inclusion of the Quran has also, and that's, in some ways it's just a math issue. 2 creates a different kind of fight than 3. And the inclusion of the Quran and sort of the expansion of understanding what the kind of intra-religious, religious developments and the sort of larger theological conversation has also taken students out of a certain type of factional thinking, not all kinds. And there's an interesting dynamic about where and how students are willing to go in hard, I think, in certain ideas from different religious texts. And that seems to be largely just the result, again, of the political moment that we're in right now, of how students do or don't feel able to talk about a religion that isn't theirs, right? A sacred text that isn't theirs, that is obviously, and always has been, a battering ram in unbelievable sort of political values, particularly, as you would say, at this moment. But I think it has invited the understanding and the thinking of theological ideas as ideas rather than confessional identities, and even more than political, because I had some political problems. My first year, I had a student, I wrote Palestine on the board, and I had a student say, I don't recognize any place called Palestine. And I just didn't know that fight. That was not a fight that I was Canadian educated, no idea what I was stepping into. And another student had to explain it to me. And that's when I realized, like Nick said, oh, this is trepidatious waters. And those waters are not the trepidatious waters anymore.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the other teachers in the room. It's not a trepidatious water anymore. There are other kinds, right? And but I think it is the idea of understanding theological ideas as well as it's part of the critique of secularism, of understanding theological ideas as affording different kinds of imaginaries, right? Different kinds of ways of understanding the metaphysical or the materially transcendent or the invitation to a world view that is radically different than the one that they see as triumphalist right now. So that's what I would say.
One doesn't want to get into religious conflict in the classroom, of course, but I don't know, I don't think you can completely, at the same time as you're trying to understand everything you're saying, deny some sort of gut reactions also. So, all right, someone has to get in trouble here, it might as well be me. So if any Westerner who reads the Quran is struck by certain, I mean, it's amazingly beautiful and powerful, but the persistent call for obedience in every surah, and it's not that the Old Testament and the New Testament don't have demands for obedience. They do.
What did you say? Isaac, Abraham, and Isaac?
And Jesus says, leave your family and follow me. But it's very noticeable, and everyone who writes about these things mentions it. So, what I'm afraid of, I guess we've said this together and privately, is a kind of orthodoxy of enlightenment, in which students are afraid that if they make an unfortunate remark, they're going to be trolled if they go against a consensus set of notions. Not that I disagree with any of these notions about gender, hierarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and so on, but the fear that they might make a mistake. And certainly intellectual independence is something that is one of the ends here, one of the goals here.
Yeah, I'm curious, what do you think?
Well, I do think that fear exists, but I'm not sure it's ideological. So the other thing that and Julie and I have talked about this, that has changed in 20 years is trying to figure out a neutral way to put this. As Columbia's ranking has, in all these dubious metrics, has increased.
Deeply meaningful.
Yes, right. The student population has tended to homogenize in one sense, which is that they are high achievers of a very particular sort. And so what you just said was resonant to me in one way, was the fear of making a mistake. That does feel now much more endemic, but I don't think it's ideological. I think it's structural to their presence here and how they succeeded prior.
Are they afraid of being trolled? I mean, literally,
no,
what is it they're afraid of?
I think it's a much deeper. I think it's a much deeper fear of. Let me put it this way. There is a way in which to really succeed in high school, it's best not to make mistakes, and it takes a certain kind of intelligence to know what not to say. Right. So I think there's. Let me give you an anecdote about this, which may help flesh out. I'm putting it badly. I got my PhD at Harvard, and I taught as a graduate student there, and it was a frustrating experience because the students were quiet, really, really quiet. And I pretty quickly discovered that the reason was that they were very savvy, and they were very savvy in the way of knowing when not to open their mouths, and only opening them when they knew exactly what was the right thing to say. So it was a dispiriting classroom experience for me. I come here.
And that was 20 years ago.
That was 20 years ago. My second day in Lit Hum, I have this practice, as you know, of writing a sort of epigraph on the blackboard. I'd done it at Harvard for years and no one had ever said a word about it. It was my second day. I turn around, and at this point I'd assumed no one was going to say. I turn around for writing it on the board, and there are like 6 arms that shoot up. And I call one person and say, "Why did you do that?"
Yeah.
And it struck me immediately, like, that's a question they don't ask at Harvard.
What was the epigraph?
Oh, I can't remember. Now, it wasn't about the epigraph per se. It was just, you are doing this thing, and I want to know why you're doing it, and I'm not entirely sure I buy that you have a good reason for doing it. Right?
Yeah.
And I will say that slightly rebellious air has kind of lapsed. It really has started to ebb away, and I think the students are cautious. Again, I don't think ideologically, but as part of their educational formation, they are achieving in a different manner and have become much more like the students that I knew at Harvard. And that's not, it's not, they're exceptionally talented, but clever in a different way, I think, than I originally saw.
I'd also say it's about trying to figure out the culture, the microculture. Students are in so many different classrooms, right? And so there's some classrooms where you are a receiver of wisdom or of, and then, so students are always trying to figure out, well, what kind of culture is this? So I'm looking at a student who is new in my section this semester. And that's something they're like, okay, well, what kind of culture is this gonna be? Is this gonna be the kind where you're gonna be up on the board, you're gonna write something down, you're gonna want me to write it down, you're gonna want me to say everything that I say, So they're trying to figure out what the culture is, right? Which is, of course, a very useful and savvy skill, right? And part of that is like, okay, is this a culture where I want robust debate that is just a performance of positions that we've already settled on? Or is this going to be a culture where people can say things that introduce deep discomfort, vulnerability, and real controversy?
Well, how do you get that going? Or does it just happen automatically?
We could say many things about that. Do you want to begin?
I mean, I've known Julie long enough. I'm pretty sure she has better techniques about this than I do, and she's told me some of them. I don't know if this works, but one of the things that I do like to do is perform my own ambivalences, and sometimes even not just ambivalences, but dislikes. So there are certain texts on the syllabus I just am ready to never read again.
I know what they are.
Yeah, you do. Right. I've even unsuccessfully tried to eliminate them. It struck me at a certain point that it was necessary to say that. It was necessary, in other words, for me to present my own fraught relationship to either certain ideas or certain figures, in the hopes that it would model unease that they could then feel safe expressing. Now, that's a slightly different thing than contention or debate, but it at least performs something other than reverence.
But I haven't heard anyone say, I don't like this.
No.
I don't want to read this. Why are we reading this? I haven't heard anything remotely like that.
It happens in evaluations. It really does happen in evaluations.
I can't help noticing that, of course, perhaps you can't avoid this teaching the Greek drama and so on. You talk about sex and death, and they were 18-year-olds, and you're nudging them a little bit to come out of their shell, if that's the right word. Of course, they're not going to talk about sex in class. It's very, very hard to be articulate about such things, nor should they be particularly. But I feel you are elbowing them a little bit.
And not.
This is what life's about.
Yeah. No, definitely the taboo about sex is one that I've found really hard to dislodge. Not just in terms of even locating it in texts. Being able to speak its existence seems like an important skill, and it feels like I don't want to be the person at the front of the room who just is constantly the figure of obscenity. But a little bit, a nudge here and there to move us in the direction of obscenity feels important to me. Yeah.
We could grab a leg when we don't.
Right. Well, we don't do that anymore. Do you have a problem with that, or?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think when I was chair of Lit Hum, in the syllabus review that we did, one of the conversations that we had was about the Decameron. And so some of you, when you took Lit Hum, you read the Decameron, Boccaccio's Decameron. I'm looking at bodies, okay. And it's a very, the more famous case that some of you probably heard about was about Ovid, right? And Ovid's Metamorphoses. But I think that in a way Boccaccio became an more interesting case for me in the sense of what many people for centuries have found deeply hilarious was no longer accessible in the same way. And again, it's like Nick was saying about, it seemed less ideological to me, although people wanted to pin it on that, i.e., right, in the age of Me Too, anything that's about putting the devil back in hell. I'm looking at the people who remember this, which is sort of a sex joke trick, is going to seem really, I felt it was less that, although that was certainly part of it, than it was what does it mean to just not have any access to the literary genres that are maybe obsolete, maybe are, like, what is a fablo? Who knows what, I'm looking at anybody under 40 in the room, who knows what a fablo is, right? Like that these are literary genres, these are modes of discourse, these are modes of irony that are simply not, and that in some ways, part of the problem with Lit Hum in particular is that these are literary texts. These are not just carriers of ideas, right? But the work to teach a literary text of the complexity of the Decameron is not going to happen in 2 class sessions, right? It's
Can
impossible.
I just argue on
right?
behalf of Decameron that
Oh no, I love it. Don't
many
get
of the I know many of the stories are about sexual intrigue initiated by women, and it's one way of talking about women's sexual agency. I don't know what other texts would lend to that conversation.
I mean, one of the things that made me most crazy when I started teaching the core is that I would have this whole semester with students, and then at the end in the exam meetings, because the whole faculty has an exam meeting where we decide what's going to be in the exam, and there's always some guy who said, I think we need a woman question on the exam. And I was always like so horrified, because I was like, what have you been doing all semester? Like really, like deeply horrified, right? And I understand that that's part of the core, of course, is that each section is idiosyncratic, right? You've got somebody who's a specialist in like Czech poetry, each section is idiosyncratic, but at the same time, right? And that's part of the homogeneity of the teaching faculty at the time. Like 90% of the people in the room were men. And they're like, well, this would be a fun little question, right? Like, what? So, and again, like that, some of those changes are again, they're simply, not simply, they're deeply demographic, right? When you have a different set of students in the class, that the things that they're going to be tagging onto from the beginning are going to be radically different, right, than when you had a single-sex, more homogeneous pedagogical environment. I mean,
30 years ago, a couple of graduate students who were teaching in the course said to me sotto voce, this doesn't actually help my career any. They're very appreciative at Columbia that you're doing it, but it doesn't help my scholarly career. But here are both of you teaching it for years, and I wonder how it intersects.
Oh, my career's been amazing.
With your own obsessions.
Well, I would say something that occurred to me literally yesterday was that my running partner is a historian who teaches at Long Island University. And we've been running together for 10 years, and my relationship with her has been marked by the increasing decline of the humanities and the social sciences at Long Island University. If you're not following it, you all should be. Anybody interested in higher education? So most recently, they've decided to get rid of history as a major. She's a historian. And to combine everything together into a humanities department. And she was saying, we're running. And she was saying, it's interesting to think about specialization in the age of the academic crisis, right? The PhD crisis, right? Where jobs for specialists, and I really noticed as chair of Lit Hum, for 4 years, a huge part of it is mentoring graduate students from a range of departments. The students in larger departments have a very different experience than the PhD students in very small departments, who the time, often there's a real, it's 3 years is the average now between getting your PhD and getting a tenure track job, if that's indeed the goal. And it's much harder for people in really small fields, like the one that Boccaccio represents. So, just having this sort of moment of being like, what of the generalist? And so what used to not be an advantage for the graduate students saying, okay, this isn't going to help me, I'm not teaching in my field, right? In other words, I'm not teaching Czech poetry, right? What is that going to mean for the future of humanities education? Not in places like Columbia and Chicago, which have not been hemorrhaging humanities majors, and partly that's because of the cores, which are gateway drugs to the humanities. It's just true.
It's just statistically true.
It's just statistically true, because you're going to meet Deborah Martinson and you're going to get so excited about Dostoevsky, right? Or, and that all of a sudden you never thought, who cares about Dostoevsky? And then maybe you're going to take a Russian literature class, right? But anyway, the point being here that I think for graduate PhD students now, teaching in the core is becoming increasingly coveted, because whatever you do, especially if you're a humanist, you're not going to be teaching what your dissertation was on. You're going to be really lucky if you're doing that, right? You're going to be teaching, like my friend, she's a post-war, the historian, she's a post-war Italian historian. She teaches world history. She's the only person at her university teaching American history. So, right, in terms of what does it mean to have that kind of teaching experience for PhD students, that's also a really changing quality. I don't know if you've noticed this as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's. I take it that part of your question was also personal about our own work, too, right? That as far as
transactions back and forth.
Yeah, no, that's right, and it has had a huge impact on my work. I mean, the book I'm working on now is kind of unthinkable without my years in the core, because I'm writing a history that covers 2,000 years of literary production, and that's insane professionally, unless you've been indoctrinated in a certain way. I mean, admittedly, it's allowed me to maintain certain things. I'm very much like a kind of classicist manqué. I was a classics minor in college. I did not do very well. My grades in ancient Greek were mediocre. But it's allowed me to keep in touch with that and to reconnect it to a different version of my specialty. But I've also, in terms of indoctrination, like almost everybody teaches the core the first time, I thought it was the most unbelievable burden. And I felt every week like I was being hit over the head with a wet pillow. Just, I couldn't keep up. It was a never-ending panic. And it's, as often happens, that state of, it's not that I by any means consider myself an expert now, but I like the feeling of slight panic, of lack of control. I really enjoy that experience of feeling like I really am not sure today. Well, that I've started to crave in ways that I don't often find in my specialty in quite the same way. Yeah.
Just fast, I'd say mine is the reverse in that I'm teaching CC for the first time because I'm writing a book right now about a 17th century polymath called Margaret Cavendish, who read a lot of political philosophy, and I was like, oh, this could kill two birds with one stone.
When those times I've talked to corporate leaders, and actually there's been some sociological work on this at Johns Hopkins, what they want in people they hire is someone who can lead a meeting or write a memo or deal with other people. A lot of corporate work is in teams. So this notion that parents seem to have, which the college doesn't seem, or anyone doesn't seem to be able to easily dispel, that you have to take courses in economics or something, or the STEM subjects that's going to lead directly to a job, is simply not true. It's simply not true. That isn't necessarily what they're looking for. I mean, my number one son was a philosophy major, and he's now running a little film company in Los Angeles. Number two was a English major, and he's working at Google full time. I mean, in the real world, there's no opposition to those who are humanities majors. I mean, so you spoke about LIU, which seems to me like a minor catastrophe. What's happening there?
It's a major catastrophe.
Major catastrophe. Yeah. I think we'd like to have questions. So, sir.
Since we're at Columbia, you don't mind the contrarian. I want to bring up the pedagogic issue. When I was a sophomore, you had to read Gargantua and Pantagruel, Paradise Lost in 2 weeks. I'm taking a French novel course, 2 weeks. I'm taking a government course, 100 pages, and I'm taking a basic science course so I can get into medical school. And I think to a great extent, this experience was bad for my exposure to the great books. It turned me off on it, and I never went back. And at my daughter's graduation, the valedictorian said, "I'd like to congratulate you all for the 20,000 pages you were supposed to read and the 5,000 you actually read." And that was at Princeton. Maybe at Columbia they're up to 10,000. I don't know.
I mean, you're not alone, right? And, you know, part of it is like, there's 22 people coming into the room. So some of it's my job, some of it's your job, right?
And isn't the experience based on your teacher? If your teacher is not good, it destroys the whole experience.
If you believe, which I do, and I know not everybody does, that this class is a seminar and not a lecture, then it shouldn't have everything to do with me. It should have a lot to do with us in terms of the conditions that we're creating, right? And the kinds of invitations, like a welcome mat laid out, right? An establishment of high standards, all right? I established really high standards at the beginning, and this is like actual, real textual engagement. The book is open. You're not just talking about the book. You're not just... The book is open. It's real substantive engagement. I actually don't care if it's like 6 pages, right? I actually really don't tell anybody I said that. I care less that you've read the 100 pages than that you've had a good faith intellectual engagement with the primary text and not through secondary mediation, right? And so if you get through just the first 3 pages, it's a win, right? I mean, I'm saying that nobody's going to become an expert on Kant in a semester, let alone, right? So it's like a taster, right? And some of those tasters, you're going to be like, thanks, but no thanks. Some of them, like David was saying, are going to stick back there, and you're going to come back to them. Some of them, it's going to be a lifelong excitement, right? I remember the student who didn't care about anything in Lit Hum. Truly, love this kid. Didn't care about anything. And then we got to Jane Austen. And it was like, boom. And she came in, she's like, okay, I've read all her novels. Who else is like her? I was like, girl,
Nobody.
I'd love to hook you up, but it ain't possible. So, you know, it's not dissing you when I say there's 22 people. There's 22 people in the room, right? And like what they're going to hear, like what I also love watching is the energy that's produced between 2 students. Like I have these amazing students from last semester. One of them, you could tell, he was like, whatever. And the other one is like, amaze balls, right? And you could watch this kid. He's like, oh, I like you. I like how you are in the world. I like how you speak in the world. Like he was just in love with the way this guy could marshal an argument, right? Could get everybody to listen to him. And that he was doing it on the basis of genuine information, not secondhand. And he just fell in love with this guy. And it just produced a kind of intellectual engagement with him that I know he never would have. It had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with the book. It had everything to do with this other student having this interaction with the book. That was like, I could do that, right? 22 people.
How have young people's changing attitudes about gender and sexuality affected the way they approach the text these days?
That's a big one. Do you want to?
I have so many things. I don't want to talk too much. I mean, I'd say that we had a really great moment, and Joanna Stolniker, who's the new chair of LitHum, can speak to this. We had a really great moment when, and some of you have probably been following this for all of you who are on Twitter or not, when we adopted the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey. And because Emily Wilson is very big on Twitter, and because Emily Wilson won a MacArthur, and because Emily Wilson has been very out about, that her translation of the Odyssey is not an activist act. There's a long history of translating rapes, for example, the most notable example, translating rapes to make them more consumable, more aesthetic, right? Like, for example, right, the one that she spoke about, which was they've learned to endure their slavery. And she translated it as they've learned to tolerate their lives as slaves. Endure as objection, tolerate as a practice, right? As a kind of ethical interface. And those sorts of things, I think, throw into relief, not just for translated texts, but for how incredibly mediated these texts are by cultural management, right? They've been famous for thousands of years, some of them, hundreds of years, others of them. And that partly, it's not about getting that mediation or that apparatus out of the way. It's sort of sitting down with the information that you can have in a fixed unit of time and sort of saying, here's the Lattimore translation, here's Emily Wilson's translation. Let's talk about that.
Well,
right?
it's even more explicit with Ovid, I think, and the number of rapes in Ovid, and what Professor Stolniker said on September 27th is that there are women who are now translating Ovid, you sort of said it, so as to make the sexual violence not softer, but as it has been in the past, but more explicit. But the second part of her point was that there's no reason to withdraw Ovid for this reason. On the contrary, sexual violence is part of life and part of literature, and it's something that you can talk about in class, and it's something you can maybe give some warning in advance what's coming up. But it doesn't mean that the text should be withdrawn because of that. And so the way that the women are changing the translation is, to me, totally fascinating. And yeah.
I mean, I'd say it's also not an accident that, that the women authors that are on the LitHum syllabus happened within 2 years. Sappho first came onto the LitHum syllabus 3 years after women were admitted to Columbia in the ripe old age of 1983. Right? And Sappho came on in 1986. When Woolf came on, it's related as well. So the demand, and we're seeing that as well as the student body changes in general, that the pressure is on, and the ideas of what people are going to be reading should evolve.
Yeah.
I was really interested by what you said about the Harvard reticence to say the wrong thing or to be perceived as not, hitting all the marks. That was my experience at the law school there. Everybody's terrified of each other. So my question is, if the students are more reticent to the core curriculum now, do you think they're still allowing the text to affect them, are still excited by their personal growth through their encounter with the text, even if they're not speaking about it as much?
I do think so. I think I register that differently than I used to. I register that often in one-on-one conversation. Those who come to see me in office hours will often talk about these things very differently than they do in the classroom. They are more comfortable sometimes, I think, registering those in private situations. But I also think that accompanying it remains, I'll just be frank, like an increased anxiety over grades that did not exist. I mean, it always existed at some level, but it seems more endemic and more acute than it did before, and sort of competes with that, other way of finding interest. And that I that is something I struggle with and have not yet found a good way, and I may be frankly powerless to combat. It's so ingrained in them by the time they arrive. And I understand the anxieties. I cannot lie to them and tell them your anxiety is foolish. It isn't. And in fact, their excessive anxiety to it has landed them exactly where they are. I will sometimes make affectionate light of it in the classroom. There are occasional moments in the classroom where I'll have occasion to say something about, I said, actually, when we were reading the Confessions recently, I explained Augustine. I said, look, he's a very good boy. Like all of you were good kids. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And let us think about what's lost in being such a good kid. And I don't know if you felt the same way. I felt a look of almost shock in the room, like, what, do you mean something's lost in this? But I feel like they do need to be confronted. I'm sounding more Foucauldian than I really am, but they need to be confronted with their compliance. They've been very compliant. They've been rewarded for their compliance. But I don't want to confront them too strongly with this. After all, I am in my own way extremely compliant too. Yeah. So it's not,
But that's why Foucault is in the spring in CC.
Yeah.
Almost
Right.
2 years ago.
Right. But I think that sometimes that love or investment can become almost a little bit more embarrassed, and so it reveals itself in private, more likely.
Sir.
I'm interested in any or all of your thoughts about an aspect of the core curriculum that's sort of in the background of what's been discussed but hasn't really been touched on, which is the communal learning aspect of the core. Because there are lots of other schools that teach Homer and Dante and you name it as part of their required courses. I don't think that's the distinguishing feature of the core curriculum. I think the distinguishing feature is the scope and depth of how many people are studying the same works at the same time. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and in particular, does it, within certain parameters, how important is it really which works end up on the desert island list, syllabus, rather than just making sure that everyone's reading the same thing and discussing and debating the same thing?
And something like 140 different works, maybe more, have been used in Lit Hum. I think.
I'm with you. I would say that should be answered by students, in the sense that what we know from our perspective is that the 22 people in the room, right? That's what we know. So we see the community at that level, and I really believe in that. I'm one of the rare professors that think 2 hours a week in a classroom is not enough. I do not like seminars that meet once a week. I don't think it's ethical, frankly. What I like about, that would not make me popular with the other professors, so let's pretend I didn't say that. Whereas I think that what's nice about the core classes is you meet twice a week. So everybody's showing up. It's an interpersonal, it's a social practice.
But I would add to that, though, that you're always reminded in ways that you are not, and I think this is entirely to the good, you are not in control.
Yeah.
They are having conversations that are entirely outside the scope.
And none of your business.
Yeah, right, and they're sometimes learning from, roommates and friends what somebody else had to say about something.
Yep.
Now, there are different reactions to this, and I'll say that I also have very strong feelings about this in somewhat in the same ways that Julie does. I don't deviate from the syllabus that the core office sets down. And that's despite often, personally objecting to certain things on it. I just do not want to turn it into my curated experience. I know people who do. I disagree with them.
Me too.
I feel like if it isn't shared, it loses so much of its value. So I will put up with my private objections, which are meaningless in the end, and do it as it's designed. And
Also, they have to take an exam.
Yes.
That's not particular to that class.
It's not, although there are ways around that too.
I want to hear from a student. Yeah.
Yeah, this discussion has been super interesting. I think that one thing that I've noticed as a emotionally charged by what we're reading. And my question is related to the affective nature of the core, because something that I experience with my friends, especially who are women, is this really psychological and emotional burden that happens at some point of reading texts in which a person truly doesn't feel represented in. And I had a friend just tell me, I cannot read another white male treatise telling me what to think. So I'm just wondering, as peers and also as teachers, how we can handle the emotional burden that occurs when one doesn't feel quote unquote naturally represented in the text.
I mean, I'm curious about how you guys are managing it, right? I mean, it's like, oh, the question was about, talking to a fellow student, a woman student, about, what does it mean to spend, in CC in particular, to spend, an entire semester and a half, not just not reading anything written by a woman, but in which the sort of positions of women are either negligible or deeply oppressed. And what about the affective sort of burden of that? So I was saying, what we have access to is what happens in our 22-person room, but what the students have access to and what are they're living is what Nick had said earlier. It's a big ask. It's a really big ask. I don't undervalue what a big ask it is. Like this gentleman said, it's like a huge ask of page numbers. It's a huge ask of time. It's a huge ask of intellectual attention that we're asking people to put on things that are objectively extremely difficult and often horrifying. And I think we just have to say that. It's impossible, it's not just that you have an indigenous student sitting next to you when they're talking about the savages, right? It's that students have a disposition in relationship that is ethical. And it is deeply affecting, right? It is. And so, I always feel like what the students are doing to share that affective burden, that both the pleasure and the difficulty, is of great interest to me. And also on some level, again, not really our business. It's like, I don't know what a dorm looks like, and that's a very good thing. Right? I feel like you're asking for something else, though, Helen.
I think so much. I just think that discussions within the core need to be more like this, super meta.
Meta, yeah.
I think that in some classrooms I've been in, the discussion hasn't been as much around the experience of reading the text and the experience of being in this space, in this world, and reading them, rather than just diving in, which is equally important. But I do think that the person who hasn't spoken up all year because they don't feel comfortable reading this material should have a space to say that at some point within the long academic year.
Yeah.
So maybe here. But I do think that, like you said, it is the position of the other student, teacher, to create that.
No, but I like what you did is you lobbed it back. And you're like, well, what are you guys doing to create the conditions? That's right. What are we doing to create the conditions for those conversations to be happening?
From a very strange perspective, maybe what I've learned a lot from, as far as my own pedagogies, I've learned a lot from therapists. And I've learned one thing, which is that it's really important. It's almost, in some sense, the point of therapy is to make that meta move. To say at certain, well-timed moments, to say, can you observe what just happened here? Let's talk about what just happened here. It's also really important to not only do that it's something about timing, it's something about allowing a certain experience to take its course and then making the meta moment. Because if you're only speaking in a meta discourse, nothing transpires. If you never speak about it, equally nothing transpires. So there's a kind of therapeutic tact about knowing when to do it, and I've really tried to learn actually from therapists about how this can occur. I'm not anywhere near as good at it as certain therapists I know, but it feels like something from the therapeutic technique that can work. Yeah.
Oh,
So sorry, but we could do this all night, obviously, because there's so much to talk about. I hope you will continue to talk about it. But David clearly has a lot of reading to do for next week for Let Him in CC. So we're going to bring the formal part of this to a close. Could you join me in thanking David and Julian? Thank you so much for participating in the evening and for celebrating the centennial with us. I hope you'll continue to do so for the rest of the year. Thank you.